Hello, and welcome to the first session in our three-part series of staff presentations on the requirements of QC 1000, the PCAOB's new quality control standard. Today's presentation focuses on the monitoring and remediation process component, specifically part 1 of 3 covering the objective of the monitoring and remediation process, general requirements for monitoring and remediation, and requirements related to designing and performing monitoring activities for engagements and the QC system itself. My name is Skylar Sims, and I am an assistant in the Office of the Chief Auditor. Given the intent of this staff presentation is to focus only on one aspect of the monitoring and remediation process component, we will not be discussing all of the nuances of the standard and related amendments. I encourage participants to read the adopting release in order to gain a more complete understanding of the new standard and related amendments, and explore our other implementation resources, which includes staff guidance. All of this can be found on PCAOB's website. Before we get started, I'll state our standard disclaimer. The views expressed are offered in my capacity as staff of the PCAOB's Office of the Chief Auditor, but they are my own and do not necessarily reflect the views of the board as a whole, any individual board members, or other PCAOB staff. As a reminder, we prepared other staff presentations covering other parts of the monitoring and remediation process component, including how to determine if engagement deficiencies exist, how to respond to engagement deficiencies, including the auditor's responsibility to respond to engagement deficiencies on completed engagements under an amended and retitled AS 2901, responding to engagement deficiencies after issuance of the auditor's report, how to determine if QC observations and QC deficiencies exist, performing root cause analysis on QC deficiencies, and designing, implementing, and testing remedial actions. These Part 2 and Part 3 staff presentations are available on our QC implementation webpage located on the PCAOB's website. In our staff presentation on the firm's system of quality control, an overview of QC 1000, we briefly covered 8 integrated components of the firm's QC system that are required to be included in a firm's design of its QC system. These components are consistent with other quality management standards. As a reminder, the 2 process components are the firm's risk assessment process, referred to as FRAP, and the monitoring and remediation process, referred to as M&R. 6 non-process components, which address aspects of the firm's organization and operations. Today, we are focusing on the monitoring and remediation process component. So the monitoring and remediation process is an integral part of an effective QC system because it creates a feedback loop to inform the firm's risk assessment process. The feedback loop assists the firm in identifying and assessing new and evolving quality risks and designing and implementing effective quality responses. It drives a firm's focus on continuing to improve its QC system with a view to preventing future engagement deficiencies. Under the standard, firms are required to implement and operate an effective QC system. That is, comply with all provisions of QC 1000 at all times that the firm is required to comply with applicable professional and legal requirements with respect to any of the firm's engagements. For any time that a firm is not required to implement and operate an effective QC system, QC 1000 will apply to the firm only in regard to the design of the QC system, based on the quality risks the firm likely would face if it were to perform engagements as defined in paragraph A3 of QC 1000. This includes requirements relating to the monitoring and remediation process. Therefore, a firm that is not required to implement and operate an effective QC system would only be required to design its monitoring and remediation process. The monitoring and remediation process applies to the design, implementation, and operation of all QC system components, including the monitoring and remediation component itself. And it provides the basis for a firm's evaluation of and reporting on whether its QC system is effective. The monitoring and remediation process must provide the firm information about the design, implementation, and operation of its QC system that is relevant, reliable, and timely. The information obtained from monitoring activities informs a firm about the actions, behaviors, or conditions that contributed to such issues. The information may also provide insights as to factors that help prevent deficiencies from occurring. Timely, as it relates to the detection of engagement deficiencies, means that a firm's monitoring activities are designed to identify deficiencies as promptly as practicable. The firm's monitoring and remediation process must enable timely remediation of identified engagement deficiencies and QC deficiencies. What constitutes timely depends on the deficiency's nature, scope, and impact. So this graphic illustrates parts of the monitoring and remediation process under QC 1000. The firm's monitoring and remediation process consists of designing and performing activities to monitor engagements and the design, implementation, and operation of the QC system, determining whether engagement deficiencies exist and responding to them, determining whether QC observations and QC deficiencies exist, performing root cause analysis of QC deficiencies, and designing and implementing remedial actions to respond to QC deficiencies, and determining whether such actions are implemented as designed and operate effectively. So let's start with the designing and performing activities to monitor engagements in QC system. QC 1000 requires that the firm's QC system include both engagement monitoring activities and QC system level monitoring activities. The two types of activities provide different kinds of information, and a firm needs to perform both to have a reasonable basis for detecting engagement and QC deficiencies and evaluating its system. So engagement monitoring activities are monitoring procedures performed on engagements, including in-process and completed engagements. And QC system level monitoring activities are monitoring procedures performed on aspects of a firm's QC system, including the firm's risk assessment and monitoring and remediation processes. We'll briefly discuss each step of the process next, but before we go into that, I want to make an important overarching point and one that firms will need to consider when designing their monitoring activities. In accordance with paragraph 44E, it is a quality objective that individuals performing monitoring activities have, among other things, the objectivity needed to perform such activities in accordance with the applicable professional and legal requirements and the firm's policies and procedures. Generally, individuals cannot perform monitoring activities over their own work. Unlike QC 30, self-monitoring is not permitted within the firm's monitoring and remediation process. That is, individuals are not permitted to perform monitoring procedures over the same areas for which they are responsible. Okay, let's talk a bit more about a firm's engagement monitoring activities. QC 1000 includes requirements related to monitoring activities over completed engagements, in-process engagements, and engagements performed at a level below a substantial role. Some of these requirements vary based on the size of the firm. So first, all firms are required to perform monitoring activities over completed engagements. One element of this requirement is that firms inspect at least one completed engagement for each engagement partner over a cyclical period. Firms can choose any cyclical period that achieves their quality objectives, but if they adopt a cycle longer than 3 years, They are required to demonstrate how that cycle is adequate to provide a reasonable basis for detecting engagement deficiencies and QC deficiencies, taking into account the factors in paragraph 64. QC 1000 also requires firms to incorporate a level of unpredictability in their selection and monitoring of completed engagements. We received a couple of questions on whether the requirement for a 3-year cycle should be applied retrospectively. I do want to emphasize that QC 1000 is effective on December 15th, 2025, and its provisions are to be applied prospectively. Next, let's talk about in-process engagement monitoring. So firms with larger PCAOB audit practices are required to monitor in-process engagements. That is, those firms that issued audit reports with respect to more than 100 issuers during the prior calendar year. And all other firms are required to consider doing so and may determine, in light of their assessed quality risks, that in-process monitoring is a necessary or appropriate part of their QC system. QC 1000 does not specify any particular monitoring activities, so the firm has discretion to select activities based on the nature and circumstances of the firm and its engagements, and the scope and nature of its other monitoring activities. Examples of in-process monitoring activities are monitoring activities performed while an engagement is still in process and include in-flight reviews performed on a specific area of an engagement or evaluating an engagement team's progress against defined milestones or performance metrics. Last and similarly, all firms that participate at a level below a substantial role in another firm's engagements are required to consider performing monitoring activities over such work and determine whether it's appropriate to do so given the firm's particular facts and circumstances. And there are factors in QC 1000 that a firm is required to consider when determining the nature, timing, and extent of its engagement monitoring activities. I'm going to talk about those in just a moment. But before that, I want to highlight that QC 1000 includes an optional scalability consideration meant to assist smaller firms in their design, implementation, and operation efforts for monitoring activities. So in general, engagement monitoring activities are performed only on engagements as defined in the standard. Basically, any engagements performed under PCAOB standards. But some firms perform only a small number of engagements. And in the extreme case, a firm that only has one issuer engagement would have to monitor the same engagement every year. In order to address this, the note to paragraph 61A of QC 1000 states that for firms that issued engagement reports with respect to 5 or fewer engagements for issuers, brokers, and dealers during the prior calendar year, engagement monitoring activities may include monitoring audits not performed under PCAOB auditing standards, provided that such audits are selected taking into account the factors in paragraph 64 and that instances of non-compliance with applicable auditing standards identified through monitoring are treated as if they were engagement deficiencies for purposes of paragraph 68D and QC observations for purposes of paragraph 72. Further, audits not performed under PCAOB auditing standards cannot be included in the monitoring required under paragraph 62B. That is, the requirement to inspect on a cyclical basis at least one completed engagement for each engagement partner. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this session, engagement monitoring activities are monitoring procedures performed on engagements, including in-process and completed engagements, which we just covered. QC 1000 includes factors in paragraph 64 that a firm is required to consider when determining the nature, timing, and extent of its engagement level monitoring activities. QC system level monitoring activities are directed at the performance of activities under the requirements of QC 1000. So this includes the requirements relating to 6 components of QC system, which address aspects of the firm's organization and operations, including the firm's risk assessment process and the monitoring and remediation process itself. And similar to engagement monitoring activities, QC 1000 includes factors in paragraph 65 that a firm is required to consider when determining the nature, timing, and extent of its QC system level monitoring activities. Due to their nature, some of the factors are similar between the two activities. So for both types of monitoring activities, the firm should consider quality risks and the reasons they were assessed as such, quality responses, including their timing, frequency, scope, and operation, the results of previous monitoring activities, and information obtained from oversight activities by regulators, other external inspections or reviews, and if applicable, monitoring activities performed by a network. Specific to determining the nature, timing, and extent of engagement monitoring activities, the firm should also consider characteristics of particular engagements and of particular engagement partners, and other information relevant to quality risks. Additional factors that are relevant when performing monitoring activities at the QC system level include taking into account the design of the firm's 2 process components, that is, the firm's risk assessment process and the monitoring and remediation process, since the monitoring and remediation process also applies to these 2 components of the firm's QC system. Changes or anticipated changes to the QC system, services or resources provided by other participants or third-party providers, remedial actions taken to address previously identified QC deficiencies, complaints and allegations, and other relevant information of which the firm is aware. Since a firm's QC system is a continuous and iterative process, these factors will generally lead a firm to perform different monitoring activities or employ different monitoring approaches over time. So lastly, let's discuss the requirements for monitoring activities performed by a network. So network monitoring activities may include, for example, monitoring the effectiveness of network resources or services that firms in the network are required to use in their QC system. If a network performs monitoring activities relating to the firm's QC system or the firm's engagements, QC 1000 includes 3 requirements. First, the firm requests, and if provided, evaluates information about monitoring activities performed, the results of those activities, and remedial actions the network has planned. Second, based on the information provided by the network, the firm determines its responsibilities in relation to the monitoring activities of the network and performs them. Such responsibilities include, to the extent appropriate, assisting with monitoring activities or responding to the results of the activities performed by the network. Third, the firm adjusts its monitoring activities as necessary based on the information it receives from the network. To illustrate, if a firm used a network independence tracking system to identify matters that may bear on the independence of firm personnel, and if the network monitored the design and operation of the tracking system and provided the firm with relevant information about those activities, the firm is required to evaluate the monitoring activities performed by the network on the tracking system. In performing its evaluation, the firm needs to understand the scope of the network monitoring activities, such as whether the firm's personnel were selected for monitoring procedures, and if so, whether the population selected was sufficient to provide a reasonable basis for detecting engagement and QC deficiencies. To the extent provided, the firm is also required to evaluate the results of the testing performed by the network. And if deficiencies were identified, the remedial actions, if any, taken or proposed to be taken by the network. Under this example, the firm would also determine its responsibilities in assisting the network with any monitoring or remediation activities related to the tracking system. Now, there may be situations where a firm doesn't receive the information requested from the network. If this is the case, the firm is not permitted to rely on the network's monitoring activities when planning its own monitoring activities. So consider a scenario where a firm requests but doesn't receive any information from the network about monitoring activities it performs over the independent software application that the firm uses. In this situation, the firm is required to perform its own monitoring activities related to its QC system in that area. Otherwise, it has no basis for concluding that the quality objectives related to independence were achieved. One last very important point I want to make about monitoring activities performed by a network is that regardless of what monitoring activities a network performs on behalf of a firm, the firm is ultimately responsible for its QC system. So that concludes our Part 1 presentation in the series of staff presentations on the monitoring and remediation process. As a recap, today we've covered the objective of the monitoring and remediation process, general requirements of the monitoring and remediation process, and requirements for designing and performing monitoring activities for engagements and the QC system itself. Before we wrap up today's staff presentation, I just wanted to remind everyone of our QC implementation webpage located on the PCAOB's website. We continue to update it as we develop additional implementation resources. These include a staff presentation of an overview of QC 1000, as well as staff guidance documents covering aspects of QC 1000 and the related amendments to AS 2901. The QC implementation webpage also includes a phone number and form for contacting the PCAOB regarding standards-related inquiries. If you subscribe to PCAOB News, you will receive a notification when the page is updated with new resources. For more information on the standard and related amendments, please also see PCAOB release number 2024-005 on the PCAOB's website. Thank you for listening and have a great day.